So this is the first chapter, which will lay the formal groundwork of what I want to do. Weak preference as deontic accessibility. So this is the outline of today. First session, accessibility of modality, and then the modal theory of ethics, a utility theory of weak preference, and a weak preference theory of deontic accessibility. You see what they are. Okay, so this is the first section. When we talk about logic, we always, the usual approach is that when we use Aristotelian sentential logic, there's something that we can't say, right? Let's say John has a wife, Mary is Peter's wife, and therefore Peter has a wife. That's something that sentential logic, traditional sentential logic can't do. And then therefore we need predicate logic. We need subject predicate terms, and we also need quantifiers, existential and universal. That's usually the motivation. And then even with predicate logic or quantification logic, we still cannot represent the sentence up above. Adolf Hitler could have won, and thus peace is not guaranteed. Because now we have modality, and only quantificational logic doesn't seem to capture the sentence. And you know, if we were to lay out the sentences that come to the conclusion, it is as if if we try to squeeze in a predicate that's could have been predicate, it might work or it might doesn't. But at least now we have a modal logic. If given some other auxiliary premises, given that it's possible that Adolf Hitler could have won, it's possible that Adolf Hitler win, and then given some other premises, we can conclude that peace is not necessary. So with the modal logic, the modal operators, we can do a little bit more. So that's modality, and these are all syntactic or sentential, or how we do proofs, right? But then there comes the possible world semantics, or the possible world theory of modality that interpret possibly P as there are possible worlds in which P, and necessarily P, all possible worlds are in which P. Of course, I'll ignore some complicated issue with, because it's necessarily that I'm fat and not fat, because in all possible worlds, I'm fat and not fat, because there are no possible worlds in which I'm that. And I'll ignore that issue here. And so with modal logic, logicians developed many things, such as the system K, system T, system ST, S4, S5, and many other various systems. And up till now, they do that with axioms. So these are the axioms, NKM45. And then there are various systems with these axioms. So the system K, those two axioms, I'm not going to go into detail about these things. It's just that back at that time, systems characterized with axioms. So that's we're fine at that time. And then came Kripke under the name, well, later on we call that the relational semantics, or I think it's how it's called, for modal logic with the accessibility relation. It's roughly like this: a W2 is accessible to W1 if and only if W2 is possible from W1. He uses the term relative possibility. W2 is relative, possible relative to W1, and he explicate or characterize what relative possibility is. Something like truth in one world is also truth in another world. But if you use truth, that restricts us to be talking about a lethic modality, and it will make us unable to do certain other things later on. And with accessibility, with this relation among possible worlds, we can redescribe the modal systems, K, T, S4, S5. Instead of using the axioms, we can use the accessibility relation. So if we don't have any restriction, it's K. If the accessibility relation has to be reflexive, we have T. And then if we add transitivity, we have S4, and asymmetric. If we asymmetry, then we have S5, which will be accessibility everywhere, something like that. Okay, these are just, okay, so this is the second, so the second section, ethics, as a metaphysics of action. So for ethics, we typically, when we study ethics, we want to know what we should do, what we should not do. And roughly, for any act at any time, it is either permitted or not. So something we can, either we may do or we may not do. And also, there are some acts at some, for any act at any time, it is either obligated or not. That some act at some time that we must do, or obligated not obligated. We must do, or it's not that we must do. So, these are what we study in ethics. Well, intuitively or traditionally, in orthodox, we want to know what we are to do. And so ethics is constituted by permissions and obligation in all situations, something like that. And with that construal of ethics, we can just then I was talking about Socrates with accessibility, and now this guy Georg Henrik von Wright, a Finnish, I think, not well. No, I forgot what he's from the Northern Europe, the Scandinavian place. So he used modal logic to talk about ethics, which is very simple. Deontically possibly P if and only if P is permitted. So deontic possibility would be, there are deontically possible worlds at P, and deontic necessity would be obligation. So if you're familiar with deontic logic, it's the O or the P or the O, which corresponds to the boxes and the diamonds. But then well, not a problem. But usually people, when people talk about deontic logic, they would think that it's non-reflexive. The accessibility relation is non-reflexive, because if it is reflexive, then if it's obligated that P, it will entails truth or fact. So it will follow that whatever that you must do, you would have done it. And that's a problem, because that's not an ethics of human beings, right? Because we seldom comply with all our obligations. So non-reflexibility. If deontic necessity is factive, then all obligations are complied with. What I said just then. Yeah, a reflexivity of deontic accessibility entails effectivity of deontic. Okay, so typically, deontic logic is not reflexive, and I have to go back to what von Wright has said, but it seems that given the tradition is like that, I don't think he would have developed a reflexive one. I have to check whether it's his system that's like that, but I'm not using his system. I'm using his idea about deontic logic as ethics, something like that. So because with that in mind, I want to investigate whether ought implies can. I use this in quote because the Quinean thing that implication is about senses. Deontic necessity does not entail metaphysical necessity. That's what I would claim, because, well, if you hold that as I think basic, then we can see that although obligation entails permission, permission does not entail possibility. Of course, what you must do, you may do that. If what you must do is something that you ought not have done, then that's just that's strange. Okay, but there might be cases in which what you may do is not something you can do, and that's arguable. But along the tradition of ought implies can, of course, your obligation must be something you can comply with. That's the traditional way of seeing things, and it has implication for ethics that has to pay attention to human psychology and our limitation. But I am hoping to develop an ethics that does not, with which ought doesn't imply can, although ought to have implied can, but that's something to follow later on. And okay, that's a simple explanation of how ought doesn't imply can, because one does not always do what one must do. Maybe because one doesn't want to do it, or maybe one just cannot do it. So there are obligations that we cannot do, but it's still obligations nonetheless. So that's like, well, okay, let me go, because that'll be another issue about dignity and human rights that it's much later on in my thesis that I want to develop. So section 3, a utility theory of weak preference. Okay, well, to a utilitarianism, that's something we've all learned about when we are in undergraduate study of ethics. And I call that an ethics of welfare. It's an ethics that focuses on our well-being, how good our life is, our happiness, and ethics of welfare. And let's say a statement of utilitarianism is that an act is obligated at a time if and only if it will have from that time maximized total welfare, and not permitted if it will have decreased total welfare, and permitted if it will have increased. So it will increase, so you may do that, but you're obligated to do much better, which is the best, to maximize total welfare. So that this is a reconstruction of utilitarianism. And decision theory, you know, the economic thing that we sometimes heard in popular on the newspaper, is an ethics of expected utility. And these two are the guys that proposed decision theory, John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. Rationality obligates selection of decision with the maximum expected utility. It's very simple. It's just to among the decisions, then you calculate how likely those the outcomes will be, and you give a value utility, how good the outcome is, and then you decide between which one would have the product of the maximum expected utility. So if something is very good but very unlikely, in contrast to something not as good but almost a sure outcome, you contrast a decision between these two. So decision theory tries to inform us about what we should do in situations like that, especially when we're making decision under uncertainty. Expected utility of a decision. So von Neumann need a utility function and a probability function. And probability function, that's something that I've investigated, but now I focus on the utility function using weak preference. This is what von Neumann and Morgenstern did. They didn't explicitly use measure theory, but that's what they did, was ranking, right? The greater than or equal to relation, and rank things, outcomes or state of affairs with preference. It is as if in a situation there's this and that, do you prefer this to that? So that would have put two things in a ranking, and that will help us to work out the utility function of the agent for that thing among these two things, because that you preferred would have a higher utility than that you did not prefer to the other thing. So in comparison, we can work out the preference ranking and hope to assign a utility function. This goes to, okay, I don't want to go into that. How the betting behavior, the study of the betting behavior. So weak preference is simply that y is weakly preferred to x if and only if the utility of y is greater than or equal to x. So preference and utility. So that's just what I said in a more clear statement. Okay. And then we would know that the weak preference relation is reflexive, transitive, and non-symmetric, because weak preference is because everything has the utility that's greater than or equal to itself. That's just the equal to part. Transitive, if something is preferred to another, and that other thing is preferred to a further thing, then you will prefer the first thing to the third thing. It's transitivity, because the value the greater than relation, it works like that. And non-symmetry, it's not anti-symmetry, it's non-symmetry. So it doesn't follow that you prefer this to that, then you prefer that to this. No, you prefer this to that, you can't conclude anything about whether you prefer this to that as well, right? Weakly prefer to that. And something special about the decision theory is that the rationality is internally decidable, because given that, if you were to know your probability function for all state of affairs, then you can, and also your preferences, your utility function, then you can decide on reflection or calculation or deliberation what to do. And that's how it's internally decidable. But there are situations in which it seems rational to decide on expected utility, but it will have turned out that it's not rational if I were right. Ranking over decisions versus over outcomes. This is a little bit complicated because ranking over outcomes, that's preference. But after you've calculated the expected utility of the decision and you rank them, it's arguable whether that's a preference ranking. But I'll ignore this scholarly discussion here and note that ranking on expected utility of decisions, they are complete, transitive, continuous, and strongly independent. These are axioms that von Neumann and Morgenstern think are true of decisions. But then this is a case in which I think even if you were to decide on expected utility, you will also think that you're irrational to have decided on expected utility, which is, let's say you believe that a restaurant sells better food at a higher price and money doesn't matter that much to you, so you order the expensive steak, but as it turns out, it's worse than the cheaper ones, and worse in terms of even if you were to taste them, you would also prefer the cheaper ones. So on expected utility, the higher price, you expect it to be better. But after you've paid for that on expected utility theory, that's what you should select. You will have come to realization that you should have ordered the cheaper one. So even if it's internally decided that that's the highest expected utility decision, you would have turned out to find yourself to have been irrational. That's something that I wanted, a case that I want to make against the rationality of expected utility. Okay, so anyway, so after all this, what I want to do is to use all these three philosophers or economists, logicians, ideas into one thing, which would be a weak preference theory of deontic accessibility. So y is deontically accessible from x if and only if y is weakly preferred to x. You need some formal knowledge to immediately work out what this is. But at least, because I've talked about how Saul Kripke uses accessibility to, let's say, redescribe different modal systems. But then, as with the deontic modality, it's an open question what the deontic accessibility is. And if it is the weak preference, then the accessibility relation will be reflexive, transitive, and non-symmetric. And I hope to investigate what follows from this accessibility for ethics. And so that's how I will study ethics formally. Yeah. Weak preference. So weak. Usually when we talk about accessibilities, we talk about accessibilities between worlds, possible worlds, but I also, of course, everyone would allow that weak preferences are over objects, including actions, state of affairs, worlds, and literally everything that's that belongs to the domain of quantification. Anything that we can name are objects, including okay. So transitivity, it will be a case that's very problematic for weak preferences, because John Broome, as a case of Maurice, So, okay, let me see. I still have time. Okay. Maurice's claim to rationality is this. So mountaineering. So there's this guy who has this set of preferences. Mountaineering frightens him, so he prefers visiting Rome. So when offered mountaineering, in contrast to visiting Rome, he preferred Rome. Sightseeing bores him, so he prefers staying home. So among sightseeing in Rome and staying home, he chose to stay home. But then when he was offered mountaineering versus staying home, he believed he could have gone mountaineering. Would he be? Let me see, stay home when he could have gone. Okay, so in that situation, he would have chosen to go mountaineering because he thinks it cowardly to stay home instead of going mountaineering. That is why, if he had a choice between staying at home and going mountaineering, he would choose to go mountaineering. Okay, yeah. So if we write his preferences down like this, it will come in a circle. The other argument against why it's irrational to have cyclical preferences, the money pump argument, because if you prefer this to that, I can always give you a little money, and then you would want something that seems better to you, and it'll go in a circle, and then you will have no money at all. But I don't. That's an argument for the rationality of transitivity. But here, this is a counterexample to the transitivity of rational preferences. Okay, and yeah, so because this is a case in which this guy seems rational, but it doesn't seem that his preferences are transitive. It were transitive, then it is symmetric at least, and my weak preferences are not symmetric. So this case presents a problem for my theory. So, but I think what it raises is what we do when we do intrapersonal comparison, temporality of preferences, diminishing marginal return. So let's say when I've eaten my steak, and then the waiter suddenly offered, "Do you want another steak or ice cream?" And I don't have to have modified my preferences. I don't have to turn vegan to have wanted ice cream. I haven't changed my preferences in terms of choosing ice cream over steak at this moment. Why? Because I've had a steak. And well, even on the typical economic theory, if I had one more steak, it's not as good as having ice cream. So I don't have to have modified my preference to have made a preference, a decision among two things that seems to be otherwise. Okay, so preference is situational, and preference ranking over two objects at a time, like the ice cream and the steak after I've had a steak, is distinct from preference ranking over them at distinct times. So after the first course, I prefer ice cream. It doesn't imply that after the first course, I should still prefer steak, because my preference when I'm not satiated with steak and my preference after I had steak, these are preferences made in different times. Okay, so
Wait, I think it's time to round up your presentation.
okay, it's almost the end. Okay, so
Okay.
preference profiles. Okay, so this is not too important. Okay, so lastly, this is the last bit. Okay, and in 1986, Jackson and Pargeter, they have a case of professor procrastinate. Roughly, it's something like this. Someone is best in his given his expertise to write a book review, but he's known to procrastinate. And then, as a friend, should you recommend that he agree to write the review, or should you not recommend that? And Jackson and Pargeter come to the conclusion that, well, maybe the actualist would think that given the actual situation as it is, and given the way that Professor Procrastinate actually is, he ought not have agreed, because if he agreed, he wouldn't write it. He would procrastinate, and the department would have a bad rap. They don't ask them to do any professional work because they will agree without doing it. But on possibilism, because he's the best person to do that. He would have written the best review, so he ought to have agreed. It's simple, like that. So this case raises the question of whether he should or should, whether we should recommend that, or even is that an objective ought that he should, or an objective ought that he shouldn't. So this is the, of course, I have to look back into the intellectual history, but this seems to be the beginning of something like a contextualism about ethics, or situational ones, if we stick with analytic philosophy. So yeah, so here it is. And these work that I've mentioned. Okay. Okay, so this is it.